In this video, we will discuss the maximum number of dimensions that we can represent on a two-dimensional graph. So if you think about an XY scatter plot graph, we typically think about that kind of a graph as showing two dimensions, the X and the Y dimension. But encoding only two dimensions into a graph is often not what we want to do. We want to try to encode as much information into a graph as we can. So what would the maximum number of data dimensions be that we could put onto a scatter plot type graph? Now, we're not going to talk about three-dimensional because later in the course we'll talk about why we want to avoid three-dimensional graphs in general. If you haven't already watched the Hans Rosling video that's posted, stop now and go back to the Hans Rosling video, because he does an example of encoding many dimensions into a two-dimensional XY graph. And we'll talk about that now. So again, if you didn't watch the video, go back now. So in this graph, how many dimensions are being used? And by dimensions, don't think of Tableau speak about dimension versus measure. Just think about the number of data fields or the number of data columns, if you want to think about it that way, that can be represented here. Now, obviously, we have the X and the Y, but what are we doing with the rest of these things? Now, thinking back to what we've talked about before, we can use different things to have meaning, things like size and shape and color, etc., and placement, all right? An interesting thing about that Rosling video that I did want to call your attention to before we get any further is the importance of exploring your data, right? So in this graph, the data tells one story, and he was very clear that when you show that same data at a different level of analysis, that story really changes. So we have to be very careful that we're using the right level of analysis in our graphs. That's kind of a side note to what this video is really about, but I wanted to point that out before we went much further. So what are the maximum number of data dimensions? So this is we're going to build this out. This is a very similar kind of graph to the Rosling graph. It's not quite the same, but the first two dimensions on a two-dimensional graph we can use are the placement dimensions, which is really just the X position and the Y position on the graph. And here you can see that we have dots that are placed in X and Y locations, and that has meaning. But we can add more meaning to the graph. And the first thing that Rosling did that we saw is he had a different color for different continents, and that's what I did here, is I added color for each continent. Then we could also add size, and we do that simply by adding a new dimension into size, and we see here that size is the size of the circle has to do with population in this graph. Then, just like Rosling did, we can use animation, and we can show things changing over time. And finally, we can use shape. Now, we're going to talk about why we don't want to use shape too much, and think about why this might be. We've already discussed the idea that comparing areas of objects is difficult, while comparing sizes of the same object, like length, is easier for human perception. But already we have an issue when we're comparing areas when we're using size in this case. But consider how much more complicated it would be if you're asking a person to compare the size of a circle with the size of a triangle. And for that reason, although these 6 dimensions are kind of the maximum number of dimensions, we're only going to use size or shape in a particular graph. So the maximum number of data dimensions theoretically is 6 on a two-dimensional graph, but practically it's only 5. We'll use X position, Y position, color, and animation, or some, maybe not all, and either size or shape. Now, another video we'll go over actually how we made the graphs in this presentation. Now, even though the maximum number of practical dimensions is 5, we won't necessarily always use that many. We'll talk about why more in the future. But again, we don't want to overload people's working memory. And so that's the maximum number of data dimensions on a two-dimensional graph. And really neat thing that we'll be doing in this class is recreating that Rosling graph that had all the moving circles. And something you should be aware of is that the Rosling graph took a team of programmers time to build. You'll be able to build it in a few minutes. And it just really goes to show how technology has evolved in the last 12 years. So that's that for this video. We'll see you on the next one.